Hello and welcome to this episode of Crowe Corner, where we discuss the topics that matter to our clients, with our clients and contacts. I'm Justin Elks and I'm Head of Risk Consulting here at Crowe, and we help our clients to be more successful by helping them to be more sustainable, more resilient and more adaptable to uncertainty. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Vishal Desai. Vishal is Chief Risk Officer at Amlin in the UK. He's got 22 years of financial services experience across investment banking and insurance, through in-house roles, through consultancy and regulatory roles, both in the UK and internationally. Latterly, and prior to joining MS Amlin, he was at the Bank of England, where he finished up acting as Chief Actuary and Head of Division for the General Insurance Risk Specialist area. Today we're going to be discussing his work and the work of his team in transforming risk management at MS Amlin, making a difference to the organisation. Vish, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Vish, you joined Amlin at what was quite a challenging time for the organisation in 2021. There was a significant amount of regulatory interest as a result of challenges in the business from about 2014 to 2019. Clearly a lot of work ongoing to rebuild trust with the regulator and to put the business on a strong footing. Always interested in why people move roles, particularly when they enjoy their current ones. So what attracted you to joining the business at that time? And what appealed about taking a CRO role in particular?
It's a good question. I think I must have changed my mind about 3 times before I actually said yes. It's surprisingly hard to leave an organisation that you've spent well over a decade at. Where you're valued, where you've helped build the teams from the ground up, where you work on really interesting things, and fundamentally where you enjoy working with the colleagues that you have. Yeah. But I think in my heart, I was more commercial than that organisation necessarily, for good reason, allows you to be. And I missed that part of my kind of career where I was part of a more commercial organisation. And I think with the CRO role in particular, it's quite unique in the sense that it really requires you to poke your nose into all parts of the business, which not only satisfies my general nosiness and curiosity, but I think it really helps you understand how a business works. You necessarily touch every area of the business in a way that perhaps some of the other roles don't. And I think with the CRO role, as it often is these days, being one that sits on the board, you also then have a real say, a real influence in how the business is run, and indeed a responsibility for that performance of that business. And I think that was a really big draw for me. And interestingly, I was lucky in a way in that in some way, shape or form over the preceding 10 years, I'd had some degree of interaction with Amlin. So I understood a lot of the organizational context, some of the specific challenges that you talked about. And that meant that I had a real ability to hit the ground running. I already had quite a clear perspective on how I could contribute. And I think there's rarely an opportunity where there's such a confluence of internal and external factors which create that really strong mandate for change. And I think ultimately the opportunity to fix and build that better was too exciting to pass up.
Excellent. And how did you go about transforming the risk function and making the changes then that you needed to? I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to consider. There's the people, there's the process, there's the wider culture of the organisation.
I mean, I think you touched there on 3 really pertinent dimensions. So perhaps let's start there, I guess. So on people, really key to have the right people in the right roles, doing the right things. And I think that largely that meant at the time going externally to help build some of that additional capability, capacity, bring some fresher perspectives to the table. And in doing that, I was really mindful to fish in different ponds to perhaps where we had before. So what I mean by that is really bring a diverse group of people to the table. So I wanted people that had experience of not only in-house roles, but also consultancy, regulatory, across retail, commercial dimensions, international experience, really a sort of what I wanted was to build a melting pot of perspectives that really, I think, then help improve the sort of critical thinking that you bring to the table. And I think other dimension was to tackle what I sometimes saw as a limiting factor in risk functions across the market, which is sometimes there's a credibility gap in that you have sometimes people that just have worked and come up through a risk function without necessarily having experience of the line one functions, which you sometimes have to provide judgment or opinion over. And I think that sometimes can cause friction. So I've actually got people who've worked in underwriting, who've worked in claims, capital modeling. And I think that's really helped make a difference. And then culture sort of related, and you touched on that. What I found coming into the organization, partly driven by the context and some of the challenges you referenced, is people had sort of lost a sense of confidence to provide a view, to have an opinion, to feel heard. So a lot of that cultural shift was certainly within my function, but even more broadly, empowering people to find their voice, to have the courage to challenge, be curious. And I think that was a really important dimension. And then you touched, I think, on process. And again, here, for me, the key was really working out how not to throw the babies out with the bathwater. Yes, there was a lot of overhaul that had to be done. Yes, there were, processes that perhaps didn't quite work, but there was a lot that did, that perhaps wasn't as effective as it could be. And I think that was a key part of kind of transforming the function, working out what did and didn't need to change. And I think, importantly, not falling in the trap of just adding more process for process sake, which can sometimes happen when you've had that much scrutiny. People just sort of think, oh, we'll just add some more processes and that will mean a more effective function. And actually, sometimes it's about taking process out, interestingly. So I'd say those three areas.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. And what would you say were the key hurdles that you had to overcome, and how did you go about addressing those things? What were the key ingredients in your success?
Perhaps three areas I'd draw upon. So the first was having an executive team, a board that really wanted risk in the room, that really valued that contribution from risk. And I think it's fair to say that when I joined, there were perhaps some different perspectives on what that should look like, what risk should do, what it can do, what it shouldn't do. So trying to bring everybody on the same table, on the same page, on what that should look like was perhaps the first step. But spending that time was a key part of being successful at the end. So it was both a sort of hurdle to cross, but also a driver of success in what we've achieved. I think the second part was being able to articulate a really clear vision from my perspective of what a best-in-class risk function can be, and a credible strategy of how you get there from where we were. And I think there I was able to leverage the benefit of my previous role. So at the Bank of England, I was responsible for the oversight of all of risk and actuarial within the GI market. What that allowed me to do was calibrate much better what good looks like, what good enough looks like, what not good enough looks like, which really helped in those conversations, I think, define what risk needed to be for ourselves as Amlin. And then the third part is that I was able to remember, particularly in those moments of doubt, self-doubt that you have taking on that type of role, why it is that the organization hired me, and that actually some of that slightly different thinking, some of that fresher perspective was actually what the board and executive wanted, even though it might have felt challenging at the time to try and land that. And I think there it was really important for me to remember something my CEO at the time who hired me said to me when I asked him, what do you want from me in this role? And he said simply for me to be myself. Don't try and be anybody else. Try and be something else. And I think that was so empowering and transformational in a way that perhaps you didn't necessarily even know. But I always maintain, I do a lot of work in D&I space, and if you can't be your full self at work, the organization will never get you at your full potential. And I think he perhaps understood that, and giving me that permission, I think, has been a key part of both myself and the team being successful in what we've we've done, actually. Particularly, which people may not know, coming into that role, I neither looked like nor identified like anybody on the executive team or the board, of several years younger than many people on that board, coming into an organization, doing a board role at a time of significant organizational distress, when sky high expectations, turn everything around, do it yesterday. That was really transformational, I think, to allow me to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you moved on to talk about probably one of the two things I wanted to talk to you about in terms of your broader executive role. So the involvement in diversity and inclusion and the work that you and the team are doing around sustainability and giving a broader support to the organisation than just in the risk box, if you like. You talk a little bit about how you're impacting on the business.
I mean, look, I think it's fair to say, like many businesses a few years ago, even topics such as D&I, sustainability, they weren't what they are now. You know, if some years ago, D&I was probably thought of as some sort of HR project, sustainability at best, something a corporate social responsibility team was tasked with taking forward. And I think the world has really moved on. And that certainly couldn't be any further from the Amlin of today, where those are really key enablers of our organizational strategy. And I think perhaps where we've helped from a risk perspective is reframing those topics through the lens of risk and with the input of risk. And so, for example, on D&I, we've really partnered with the business in helping to articulate our strategy, in challenging the business in the same ways we do with any other risk or performance dimension. You know, what are we doing in that space? And I think perhaps that's helped us move further and faster than without that partnership. So we've been able to sort of articulate targets for what we'd like in that space and then challenge the business on the kind of interventions we are taking to get us there. So it just means that our delivery and progress is more intentional. And then similarly on sustainability, you know, we've interestingly, unlike many of our peers, we've really positioned that responsibility in line one under our strategy and transformation director, which really speaks to that being a key strategic priority, but also that point that there's a journey to go on there for all insurers in managing that transition to a sustainable future. And I think we still chair the sustainability committee, which is then our governance forum in terms of the operational oversight over delivery on sustainability. And I think that's how we've helped the organization shape its strategy, to articulate risk appetite, to inform now some of the metrics we want to use to measure our progress and support more informed decision making in that space. So I think, you know, the last few years have been quite transformational in those two areas as well, which is beyond what perhaps historically a risk function might have been involved.
Absolutely. And we talked quite a lot about the challenges and opportunities that you faced over the last couple of years. Where do you see the challenges and opportunities for the next 2 years?
If I perhaps reflect on the previous 2 years, I'd articulate the first year really being about remediation. The second year then a lot about consolidation. So for me now, the next 2 years is about how do we close that gap down to best in class? What are those sort of incremental, continuous improvements that we can make to close that gap down? And I think for me, that is about a few things. Firstly, leveraging the voice that risk now has in the business, not just at that sort of executive level, but permeating that down through every level, peer to peer, which means that the risk culture in the organization spans beyond just what risk management team brings to the table. And that, I think, can then be really transformational to the quality of day-to-day interactions you have, where the business is actively seeking out the input from risk. And there's a plethora of examples where that happens already, which is really exciting to see, because you can kind of see, okay, now the green shoots are coming through of the work that you put in over the previous couple of years. And I think just building that out is really important. I think the second piece is having brought in really top talent to the function, really creating that culture and environment and the opportunities for that talent to thrive is important for me as a leader of that function. And then thirdly, you know, we've spent a lot of time on the here and now necessarily, but I think at its best, a risk function helps you to see what other people aren't focused on. Yeah. Like what's coming in 12, 24 months time, either from a risk perspective, but actually also what are the opportunities that we need to prepare ourselves from now that actually won't materialize for another couple of years. Broadening out our time horizon of thinking is an important next step as well.
We worked together as part of your journey over the last couple of years. What's it like to work with Crowe?
2 words spring to mind: pragmatic and proportionate. When you joined us, there was this whole series of reviews happening, all sorts of recommendations, and what could have felt very much like an exercise that was being done to me in my function on behalf of the organisation felt more like one that was done with me. I think you and your team were also open and receptive to different ideas, different ways of addressing recommendations, rather than a very prescribed format of here's a recommendation, this is how you're supposed to achieve it. And I think that's ultimately led to a better outcome because it balanced well what really needed to be done here and now with what would be useful going forward, but in the context of the vision I had. So it was very proportionate, very pragmatic. And I think also when I joined, I was drinking through a fire hose for about 6 months of information, and you were able to, with your team, help me sort of navigate wood for trees in that.
Vish, thank you ever so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
It's been very insightful and very useful. That's the end of our episode today. Thank you for taking the time to watch. I hope you enjoyed our discussion on embedding risk management and getting the value from it. If you'd like to discuss the topics that we've covered today, then feel free to reach out. Do look out for future episodes of Crowe Corner. Thank you.
Thank you.